Hey everybody, today we are going to be taking a look at an Empoleon deck from the 2008 format. Now, personally, I think the Empoleon versus Gardevoir match in 2008 it's a really fun matchup to play, it's a really exciting matchup to play, and it's a very skill-based matchup to play. Now, the Empoleon list that we're going to be taking a look at today is going to be Alex Brosseau's, or Big Chuck's, Empoleon deck, and Alex went 8-0 in the grinders with this to grind into Worlds, and then proceeded to go 7-0 in Swiss, before eventually losing in the top 32. Now, I will fully admit there's a lot of different ways to do Empoleon. There was a lot of very different successful ways to play Empoleon as well. Alex's is one of them. Dylan Lefavour won it, won Worlds in Seniors with a different variation of Empoleon, and there was the Frank Diaz variation. Jimmy O'Brien version ended up in the top 4 and I think top 8 as well, and that was a completely different variation to the one that Chuck was playing. The reason that I like Chuck's is it's an incredibly straightforward and to-the-point Empoleon deck. The entire idea is I play Empoleon, arguably the best Pokemon in the 2008 format. I am just going to try to optimize my deck to getting Empoleon out as quickly as possible, and to stream Empoleon after Empoleon after Empoleon after Empoleon. I don't need to do anything fancy. I don't need to play any tricks. I literally just need to throw Empoleon or Bronzong into the active spot repeatedly to win the game. Now, the main strategy of the deck is that we are going to be using Empoleon to put 30 damage on different Pokemon our opponent has in play. We also have Bronzong here to put damage counters on any of our opponent's Pokemon with Pokepowers. Pain Amplifier is also another attack which can manipulate damage. But essentially what we're going to be trying to do is to be spreading a lot of damage while keeping our Scramble energies active so we can take advantage of Scramble. Now, there's a couple of different things. One, Bronzong is especially good against Gardevoir because of the psychic weakness here. On top of that, Empoleon also has massive damage with Surf together. So, well, the main strategy is definitely going to be a spread strategy. The deck also has the ability to put a lot of aggression to the active spot and do some very large damage numbers as well. So, starting off here, we're going to be playing 4 copies of Piplup. Nothing too special with Piplup. It is nice that we can get that 60 HP is good, 1 retreat cost is good, and then the free Peck Attack is always nice as well. Prinplup is actually incredibly strong for our stage 1, being able to put 10 damage on each of your opponent's Pokemon. You can find yourself in situations where you literally don't do anything, and you just leave Prinplup in the active spot and you just are Aqua Showering every single turn. The 2008 format really didn't have a lot of good healing options, so essentially whatever damage you spread was more than likely going to stay in play. Now, I will say leaving the Prinplup in the active spot wasn't a very common strategy. It wasn't I won't even say it's a very good strategy, but it is an option the deck can have. Let that first Prinplup get knocked out, activate your Scramble energies, and just go from there. But the real bread and butter of the deck is, of course, going to be Empoleon. You're going to just be looking to dual splash as often as possible, just putting that 30 damage all over the place. And then we're going to go into Bronzor. Nothing too special with Bronzor here, just your basic stage 1. The Hypnosis attack was always nice. And then Bronzong, which for a stage 1 is actually incredibly strong. The Cursed Alloy is just unbelievably good. And something to note is if, let's say, an Empoleon gets knocked out, you can bring up Bronzong and then have that Cursed Alloy power just start triggering. And obviously, Pokepowers are very common in the 2008 format, so you are going to be hitting a lot of different things. Claydol is going to be the most common. Obviously, Gardevoir as well also has a Pokemon power. Dusknoir might be another very common thing that you would come across as Pokemon powers. Leafeon, there's just every single deck is going to have at least something. If nothing else, they're probably going to play Claydol. And then having Pain Amplifier be a free attack I think is also really nice, because that means that you can literally just bring Bronzong active, sacrifice it, without actually committing any sort of actual energy attachments to it. 2 Baltoy, 2 Claydol, 1 Absol EX, Absol just lets you pull knockouts out of, basically out of nowhere, where if your opponent thinks they're safe on something, you can Curse Dice and then Dual Splash for the knockout. I'm going to say that I think Absol is a very high-risk, high-reward play. Obviously, Dusknoir was incredibly common in the 2008 format, so one, you're adding that extra, basically a pointless bench spot to your bench, where that Absol is always going to be stuck there. And then two, it gives a deck a bad opener, and you don't play crazy amounts of basics. You play 4, 7, 9, 10, 11 basics. So starting with Absol isn't that unlikely. Does the risk out-reward, I guess out-reward the reward for it? And I think that's something obviously Chuck thought it did. Personally, I am not a huge fan of Absol EX, but I can get the logic behind it. One copy of Chatot, probably one of the best cards ever printed in the Majestic Dawn set, and that's saying a lot because there's a lot of good cards in there. But basically, it was a 60 HP free retreater with a free new hand attack that you could easily grab off of a Call Energy, a Rozan's, a BB's, a Celios. So essentially, we had 4, 8, 10, 14 different ways, along with a Chatot, so 15 different ways. So essentially, 1 in 4 cards in the deck would be able to get Chatot out, and essentially once you had that Chatot out, you could use that to set up. So this is to start where you really started to see it was hard to, how do I want to say it? It's really hard to dead draw, and now it's definitely certainly possible, but the deck just has so many different options to get out of a dead drawing situation, which was nice and did a lot for consistency. Now, I'm going to say this is a fairly standard Empoleon list, and like I said, I won't say the list is standard, I'll say that Chuck played a very straightforward deck. You saw with a lot of other Empoleons, they would try to play, say, like a 101 Dusknoir. That was very common. Dylan Lefavour's, and I'll post his at the end, played a lot of different, I think he played like Tauros in it. You saw lists like Jimmy O'Brien's and Frank Diaz, where they played a very thin Claydol line, and then Cess Crystals and all this other stuff. And the thing that I really like about Alex is he just played nothing but straightforward consistency. And he's just like, Empoleon's the best. I'm going to just play straight Empoleon. I don't need any tricks. Now, something I do want to note, and you're going to see this a lot in the 2008 format, is where players are using a combination of Celios Network and BB Search for Pokemon Search. So essentially, Chuck played 6 Pokemon Search, and this was pretty common in this format. You saw a lot of players take advantage of Celios and BBs being in the same format together. And I also want to add that I do think playing the Celios Network was more common because you weren't forced to put a card back in. And with Psychic Locks all over the place, and you're not getting powers, you're not using Claydol, that draw for turn was huge, because that was your main guaranteed draw outside of having a Steven's Advice or a supporter. So you didn't want to put any dead cards back into your deck. Now I'm going to say, though, there's some arguments to be made to play a higher BB's count, so you're getting stronger Claydols off. You can Claydol for more cards. I think there is a much larger argument for playing BB Search and, say, Gardevoir, where you'd want to search a Jirachi EX, for example, a Gardevoir Level X, just cards that Celios Network is not going to be able to get you. And then you're just kind of doing a risk versus reward analysis on, is potentially putting a dead card back in my deck going to outweigh the ability to grab, let's say, a Jirachi or a Gardevoir Level X. But that's a conversation for a different deck. Obviously, as Chuck did not play any sort of Level X's, the only argument would be for that Absol there. And, of course, the better Claydols. So just a little thought process that goes into deck design or deck creation for this format. 4 copies of Rozan's Research. Obviously, that's going to get you your basics. You also play your 7 Water Energies. 4 Rozan's a standard. Plays 3 Steven's Advice. It was so common for decks in that format to play with large benches, even with Dusknoir. And if Chuck is going against, say, a Gardevoir deck and they're Psychic Locking and they feel that they're not going to get Dusknoir, then they're just going to fill their bench. And then Chuck is going to get great Stevens off every single time. Ironically, and I always found this kind of funny, was players would be very careful to play around Dusknoir, but if it got around in a tournament that, hey, let's say Alex doesn't play Dusknoir, for example, players would just routinely fill their bench. And ironically enough, that would actually help Alex, because then his Stevens would get insanely better instead of players playing around, let's say, Phantom Dusknoirs that just don't exist. So a little bit of an ironic twist on how that works out. Like we talked about, 2 BB search. And then this is, I think, probably one of the most ingenious additions to the deck, is energy removal number 2. This is actually, from my understanding, a tech that Colin Mall came up with, and then gained popularity among a lot of the top players heading into Worlds that year. But the logic behind it was there were so many good special energies in play, like ER2, Scramble Energy, that if you are able to discard even just say 1 or 2 of those over the course of the game, that can have such a major impact on the outcome of the game. Going along with this too, Empoleon has such control over the board as far as where you're putting your 30 damage and what things become threats, that ER2 just gives you a little bit more control as well, to kind of, I guess, just determine how big of a threat a target's going to be. Maybe you can just spread 30 to something and then know it's going to get knocked out with Surf together, and then you can, if you hit an ER2 on something, then you don't have to put that 30 damage on it. Just little things like that can come up as well. And I should have mentioned that before. That was one of the biggest things with Empoleon. And I've talked about it a lot in different videos, where sometimes the threat is actually more, can be more detrimental or more painful than the actual reality of the situation. And that's something that Empoleon does so well, is that they can dual splash and put their damage as they need to. But that Surf together does 50 damage plus 10 more damage for each of your bench Pokemon. So essentially, if you have, let's say, 5 bench Pokemon, Surf together is hitting for 100. So you can put 30 damage on something like a Gardevoir, for example, or a Glade, and you are constantly threatening that, hey, I can knock you out at any point, at any time I want. So just the fact that you have that option, or you are threatening that, will or can impact how they have to play the game, which I think is just so crazy good in a deck like this. 4 rare candy, pretty much essentials, considering that we're going for that fast Empoleon. There's nothing scarier in this format than a turn 2 dual splash from Empoleon. Probably, I guess, a turn 2 Psychic Lock, but nothing, second best attack in the format, or turn 2 attack. 2 Warp Point. Main idea here is not only does that give Chuck a little bit more control of getting out of special conditions or things like that, or forcing his opponent to awkward spots, it is a very small answer to Cess Crystal. Chuck opted not to play Cess Crystal in his deck. He opted not to play Windstorm in the deck. So if he needed to turn Claydolls back on or something like that, just to get out of a rough spot, then he does have Warp Point for that. It can also force his opponent into an awkward situation. Let's say they don't, for example, we'll go back to that dual splash situation where we put 30 on a Glade and then we Warp Point. They don't want to bring Glade up because then they know that we can Surf together for the knockout, so maybe they have to bring up something less appealing. Let's say a Muck or a Jolteon Star, for example. And then all of a sudden, we just leave that Jolteon Star alone or that Muck alone, and we start spreading around it. So there's a lot of little uses for Warp Point. 4 Call Energy, just essential to getting our basics active out. I also want to note that Call Energy works really well with the deck because Dual Splash just requires 1 water, 1 colorless, or it can be serve as a colorless attachment for the Surf together. 4 Scramble Energy. Scramble is just outstanding in a deck where you can basically decide if you're going to be behind on prizes. And this was another deck where you could easily play down 2, 3, 4 prizes and end up just coming back because of how strong Scramble Energy. It's also very important to note that Gardevoir relied. I didn't rely on Scramble, but Scramble is a huge asset to Gardevoir as well. And you're essentially removing Scramble from ever being active in that format or against that deck. 7 Water Energies. A couple things to note here. That gives us a total of 11 energy, so we should hit that turn 1 energy drop. On top of that, it also just plays as a good number. It gives us a total of, I believe, 15 energy here, which may seem high. But you got to remember, there's going to be so much there's not going to be a ton of, you're expecting to play against a lot of Gardevoir where you're not going to have power, so having that, being able to manually draw into energy is very important for the deck. And it's easily searchable with Roseanne's here. Something to kind of interestingly note in this format was Many people considered Empoleon to be the best deck in the format, but they didn't believe it was better than Gardevoir in a 30-minute time frame. Because Gardevoir did such a great job of taking a big lead with Glade, and then just controlling the game with Psychic Lock, where against a deck like Empoleon, they might not be able to win the game, but they can make sure they're ahead on prizes at the end of it. And just basically from their slow game plan, all the powers they're doing, because you're going to have a Cosmic Power, you're going to have a Supporter, you're going to have a Telepass, just so many different things that they can do during their turn that you can basically just make sure your turns can take ridiculously long. I remember I was playing at a States, and I was playing against the guy's name was Matthew Alvis, and I think we were 25 minutes into the game, and essentially one prize had been taken. And that was very, very common for either Gardevoir mirrors or in different sort of Gardevoir matchups where just the turns would take so long, players were trying so hard to play around Scramble Energies. So it was a lot of the time, Empoleon's biggest threat was actually the time frame. I believe for Worlds in 2008, they actually increased the round time from 30 minutes to 40 minutes for a game just because of how dominant Gardevoir could be in that 30 minutes, where essentially a player would just get ahead on prizes and then stall the game out. Either legally or illegally, depending on how you looked at it, just by taking long turns doing the same thing, Telepass, Cosmic, Supporter. So, kind of an interesting fact there. Other than that, like I said, I think this is not the only way to do Empoleon, but I do think this is my favorite version of Empoleon. Just something straightforward and consistent. Doing the deck breakdown here, it seems like a very simple deck, but when you really get into the strategies, you really start to get how much of a thought process goes behind or goes into choosing dual splash targets, when to bring Bronzong active, when to Pain Amplifier. Is there ever a reason just to pass and not Pain Amplifier? Just in these spread decks, there's so many little decisions to be made. But I hope you enjoyed the video. If you ever have a little bit more interest in the 2008 format, I really recommend playing this against the Gardevoir deck I featured a month or two ago. I think it's a great matchup where there's a lot of little skill elements to it, and it's a lot of fun to play. But other than that, I hope to see you in the next video.